Overcomers. Gentlemen, Chris here from Woodruff Road Christian Church. Happy to be with you again for another bit of chapel. Doing this online here, digitally recording this. Hopefully you get to watch this and get to experience something with me as we walk towards being men who are more like Christ. I want us to jump into the book of Exodus. So that's where we're going to be this whole time, is the book of Exodus. So I'd love for you to turn there and just go right to Exodus 1, first page of Exodus. Now we're going to talk about a character today that I think we can relate to. I know we can relate to, and I hope will relate to you and the journey that you're on, that we are so ridiculously proud of for you making and being on. And that's the journey of Moses. Now, for most of us, and I want to get this out of the way pretty quick, Moses' journey is interesting. Most of us are influenced most by Charlton, Heston, Moses. That is, the greatest story ever told. If you ever watched those movies, or, we have this image of Moses with this beautiful staff, flowing long hair, beautiful robes, very powerful voice, and doing the will of God and acting out the will of God, whether it's in the plagues or crossing the Red Sea. Oh yeah, being the man, Moses. Being the epitome of godly man. Strong, confident, with an all-powerful staff that, is a stick that, you throw it down on the ground, it becomes a snake, pick it up, woo, it's just a stick again, woo, I'm going to make water come from a rock. We have this idea of Moses being just a beast. And we want to be like Moses, right? Of course we do. That's of course we do. We want to be like Charlton Heston. Man, he's just the epitome of cool as Moses. No. Well, yes, we do want to be like Moses. I take that back. We do want to be like Moses. But I want to look at aspects of Moses' life that I think translate more into you and I than Charlton Heston Moses. I want to talk about journey Moses. Being refined Moses. The Moses on the path to becoming Charlton Heston Moses. Because I think if that's only aspect of who we see him be, we will be missing out on something that's extremely relevant to you and I right here, right now. Here's why. The path to becoming that Moses, powerful, strong, man of God Moses, the path to becoming that is extremely long, extremely difficult, and full of failure and tripping. So let's talk about this and maybe have a new understanding for where we're at in our journey, where you're at on your journey to beat addiction, and where I'm at on my journey to live the most godly life that I possibly can, so that one day I can stand in front of God and he will look at me and say, well done, good and faithful servant. That's what we want. So let's look at this idea of journey and the aspect of the journey we're on, and maybe lose some of those misconceptions of Charlton Heston Moses and find ourselves relating to Moses as he became that. So first start Exodus chapter 2, verse 10. Moses grew up a stranger in the land. Moses was not home. Moses had an amazing circumstance amongst Pharaoh wanting to wipe out all the Hebrew boy babies because he's afraid of them becoming too powerful, too strong. And Moses was born, and yet Moses was protected by his mother and sister and became a child in Pharaoh's family. Exodus 2:10, later when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. The princess named him Moses. God didn't name him Moses. God didn't change his name to Moses. His mother didn't name him Moses. Pharaoh. Ultimately, the enemy of our story, his daughter, named him Moses, for she explained, I lifted him out of the water. Moses' story does not start in a grand, awesome, amazing place. Moses' story begins as a refugee, a stranger, being placed in a situation that is not his own. It is not his family's. It is not where he was born into. he was thrust into a new life and became an outcast, a stranger in that life. And that shapes him. I believe that shapes his character into somebody who actually will argue with God. Now, it takes a lot to do this. You see, Moses gets thrust into a journey. Moses gets placed in a path as he starts out a stranger in the land. Moses gets placed on a path that will refine him, that will truly start to shape his identity. And it's not the path that I think we think should be a hero's path. Exodus chapter 3. As Moses has found himself in a powerful position in Egypt, he kills a man, commits murder, and has to run. And he runs for his life. And he ends up in the land of Midian. And there, Moses finds himself doing something that he probably didn't expect. The exact opposite of what he was doing in Egypt. Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. One day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. That's a small sentence with big power. Moses, who went from being a prince in Egypt, truly powerful, truly influential, having all the things that we think maybe we'd want, money, power, servants, freedom, he finds himself reshaped by taking care of somebody else's sheep. He has to do the dirty work. And you know how long Moses did this? 40 years. 40 years of taking care of dirty, smelly sheep. So he did not go right from Egypt back into God's powerful tool. Moses had to live in the wilderness for 40 years, taking care of not his own sheep, not building his own wealth, not doing something that will benefit him, taking care of his father-in-law's sheep, taking care of somebody else's flock. And Moses, in that journey there of doing somebody else's work, learned. Now, how many of us actually learn the lesson the first time? Anybody want to raise your hand? Did you learn the lesson the first time? Did you learn the consequences the first time? No, I don't think so. God understood that in order for Moses to be the man that he needed him to be, he had to be refined. He had to be worn down into a servant with somebody else's sheep for 40 years. And so that is finally when God encounters Moses, and God comes down to Moses in the burning bush after Moses had learned for years about what it means to be a shepherd, a servant, somebody who can actually be shaped into something else, is not so full of themselves, full of their own pride, full of their own power, full of their own strength, and to think that I've got it, I can do this. No, Moses needed to be broken before he could serve. And even then, as we look in chapter 3 here, even then, after Moses is humbled, he still has the guts to argue with God's plan and God's will. Well, that's not relatable, is it? You want me to love people and forgive people? No, I'm not going to do that. You want me to be a peacemaker? No, I don't want to do that. We argue with God all the time. We argue with God's commands all the time. Moses had the guts to argue with God, not some written words or a book or a representative, somebody speaking the words of God. Moses argued with God. That takes some guts. Chapter 3, verse 11. But Moses protested to God. Who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt? God had just told Moses, you're my guy. You're my guy. You're the one I want. And he says, well, no, who am I to do this? Moses argues with God. Verse 13, but Moses protested again. If I go to the people and tell them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they'll ask me, what is his name? What should I tell them? Who are you? That's what Moses is asking God. Who are you? After God has already told him he is. Chapter 4, verse 1. But Moses protested again. What if they don't believe me or listen to me? What if they say the Lord never appeared to you? What if they don't believe me? Exodus 4:13. Then Moses again pleaded, Lord, please send anyone else. I don't want to do this. How many of us have wanted to quit? Because the job in front of us is hard. How many of us have wanted to throw in the towel, go back to our old lives, of not having to take care of anybody else's sheep, of not having to be responsible, of not having to go on this journey of healing and doing what God wants us to do because it's too hard? How many of us want to skip the hard stuff and go right to the victory? Moses didn't want to do it. God said somebody else. Now this is when I think there's two parts of Moses' life where I thought, oh, you might have gone too far. Because in verse 14, then the Lord became angry with Moses. That's probably the one place you don't want to be, is God angry at you. That burning bush could have become a burning dude. Anyways, Moses argues with God's plan, argues with God's will, but finally accepts it. Finally trusts God to be God, that God will do what he said he's going to do, and he goes back to Egypt. Now on this journey, this is probably the most surprising verse in all of Moses' story right here. Exodus chapter 4, verse 24. Now remember, we got to get some context here. God had just told Moses, you're my guide to deliver my people. It's all you. You're going to be the vessel. Through you is going to be my power. All the power of creation in the plagues. You're going to do amazing wonders and signs. God has just put his stamp of approval on Moses. And God has just put his stamp of approval on Moses. You're my guy. And then this happens. Exodus chapter 4, verse 24. On the way to Egypt, at a place where Moses and his family had stopped for the night, the Lord confronted him and was about to kill him. Moses was about to be killed. Why? Because he made one exception to holiness. Moses made one exception. He decided to not do just one thing that God had asked his people to do, and therefore God was going to kill him. Why? Because if Moses showed up in Egypt with a son who had not been fully circumcised, if Moses showed up not having followed the rules that God had put in front of him, all credibility and all respect would have been lost. Moses made one exception, and God was ready to kill him. Moses, like us, is called to holiness, called to being right. No exceptions. And yet Moses was willing to make an exception. Just one thing, just one time, it's okay. And God was ready to go a different direction. How many exceptions have we made or think we can make and still be okay? Still be the victory, still be the man of God. And yet here we see God expects holiness. God expects us to be perfect as he is perfect. All of these commands that God has given us, love each other, forgive each other. All of these commands, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. All of these ideas of who the Christian man is are not exceptions. No exceptions to holiness. Under threat of death. Moses' wife does some quick work. Saves the day, and we still have Charlton Heston as Moses, not Charlton Heston as Aaron. And we get back to Egypt. Now, this journey that Moses has been on for decades is about to come into a place of pretty great, action. We're about to get down to the power of God. We're about to get down to the power of God being evident in Moses. Boom! Big things are about to happen. All the special effects are about to happen. But first, Exodus chapter 5, 1 and 2. After this presentation to Israel's leaders, Moses and Aaron went and spoke to Pharaoh. They told him, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so they may hold a festival in my honor in wilderness." "Is that so?" retorted Pharaoh. "And who is this Lord? Why should I listen to him and let Israel go? I don't know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Moses had to publicly display his allegiance to God. Moses had to have an uncomfortable confrontation with Pharaoh. Moses had to be the only one in the room who would stand on truth. Moses had to be the only one in that land who would stand up for the name of God. How many of us want to stand alone in a room and say, we believe? We trust in God, not in man. How many of us want to be the only one in the room who will stand up now for truth and declare the name of Jesus, declare ourselves dependent on a covenant relationship with Christ, even if that means being refined like Moses? How many of us are willing to do that alone? Moses was. And we're starting to see some of these moments in Moses' life that don't look so cool, that don't look so easy, that don't look so rewarding, that don't look so movie ready. And things get worse before they get better. Because Moses stands up and does what God asks him to do. Because Moses stands up as the man of God and the plagues start happening. And Pharaoh is threatened. Because of Moses' holiness and allegiance to God, things get worse before they get better. Israel gets punished. Pharaoh gets angrier and angrier. The journey home, after Pharaoh finally relents, is still long. The journey back to where God had them intended to go is still long, full of trials that got the best of everybody. There were whiny people. Now, none of us whine, right, when things get difficult. They got hungry. And they said, we'd rather have died in Egypt than come out and starve in the desert. They got thirsty. We'd rather be slaves than thirsty. They got angry. Moses got angry. Moses threw down the 10 commandments, these commandments given to him by God. He was so angry with the people and ready to wipe everyone out, he was ready to quit. But every time this happened in Moses' life, and here's our point for tonight, every time things got difficult, every time something was about to go wrong, every time Moses was about to trip, every time Moses was about to make a mistake, God shows up. Every time. Now, God shows up to Moses in the desert. Let's go back. God shows up and protects Moses when every other baby boy is being thrown into the Nile. God shows up, protects Moses. He's drawn out of the river, raised alive. God shows up when Moses has to run for his life and he's taken to Jethro in Midian. God shows up and gives Moses a safe place to land. Moses is then refined through 40 years of servitude, learning what it is to be a shepherd. God shows up in the burning bush to tell Moses, I have something greater for your life. God shows up. God shows up when Moses says, I can't do it. And God shows him his power. God shows up in Egypt in amazing ways through the power of creation. All the things that we have not seen since before time began, God shows up and does right there in the presence of Moses and Pharaoh and everybody. God shows up. When Moses wants to quit, God shows up. When the people are starving, God shows up. When they're thirsty, when they're afraid and they see Pharaoh's armies running down towards them, God shows up, parts the Red Sea. When they're lost, God shows up in a pillar of cloud. When it's dark, God shows up in a pillar of fire. Every time, God shows up. Even when Moses makes the mistake and is about to make an exception to holiness, when he's okay with sin, when he's okay with just one little thing, God shows up. And God expects something better from Moses. You see, God is always there to deliver us. Always there. But first we have to make it through the desert. First we have to make it through the waiting, through the hard parts. First we need to find ourselves redefined and refined into men of God, because every time we do, God will then show up in our lives. We have to get through the hard parts. Then he'll open the Red Sea and we'll walk across on dry land. Well, there's one more aspect to Moses' life that I don't think we realize. Now, some people give it a bad rap. See, Moses never got to go into the promised land. Moses never got to make that final leap into everything that God had promised them. You see, God had promised Moses that he was going to lead the people out of Egypt into the promised land. People are idiots. They make a mess of things, and they have to wander in the desert, and a whole generation dies off. Moses gets angry, makes a prideful mistake, and God has to come to him and say, you can't go in. Moses, as he's about to die, gets taken up top of a mountain overlooking Canaan. He doesn't get to go in, but he gets to see. Even then, as Moses is dying, God is refining him to the very end. And so even though Moses doesn't make it into the promised land, even though Moses doesn't get to march in and have that victory parade like we think he might deserve, God still shows up. So as we look, this is a very abridged version of Moses' life. As we look at this journey that Moses had to go through, I want you to look around at your own journey. I don't care whatever stage you're in, whatever level you're in. Are you in the desert? Or are you on the edge of the Red Sea? Is addiction chasing you to the point where you're ready to give up and go back to the old life? We might as well die in Egypt rather than die out here. Look around at the journey you're on. Are you being refined for something better? Are you being refined to become a man of God just like Moses? Yes. And every time the things get most difficult, every time it gets so dark you can't see where you're going, every time you think you want to go back, God will show up. Open your eyes. Open your hearts. Find yourself made new through the desert, through the wilderness, through the refining. It's not just about the victory lap. It's about the process and the journey. And that is the power of Moses' story. Let's be like Moses. All of it. See you later, guys.